Imagine a massive modern tech giant, like, let's say Apple, or maybe a global logistics behemoth like Amazon.
Okay.
Picture them arriving in a foreign country, and they're simply looking to set up a few warehouses, just to sell some products.
Right, just basic commercial trade.
Yeah, exactly. But now, fast forward a few decades, that same corporation isn't just selling products anymore. They are, legally collecting all the taxes in that country.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is. They command a massive private standing army. They're running the Supreme Court, dictating laws, executing citizens. I mean, it sounds entirely absurd, right? Like the plot of some dystopian cyberpunk novel. But in the 18th century, that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, it is the ultimate historical example of mission creep. I mean, a private business venture that accidentally, over the course of centuries, swallowed a whole subcontinent.
Oh, wow.
And in doing so, they sort of inadvertently created the entire bureaucratic and administrative spine of a future independent republic.
Welcome to this deep dive, custom tailored just for you. Today, our mission is to explore the incredibly complex, often chaotic historical background of the world's largest democracy, India.
Right.
We are grounding our entire conversation today in a really highly authoritative source, excerpts from M. Laxmikanth's Indian Polity, the 8th edition.
It's the definitive text on that.
It really is. We're specifically looking at the historical framework that led to the modern Indian constitution. And the main premise here, the thing we're trying to figure out, is how on earth do we get from a corporate trading charter in the year 1600 to a fully sovereign democratic republic in 1950? So, okay. Let's unpack this. Where do we even begin?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to look at the mechanics of how a corporation actually transitions into a government. Because for the first century and a half, the British East India Company was purely commercial.
Just a business.
Exactly. They had trading posts, they bought spices and textiles, and they made their shareholders back in London very, very rich. But the massive paradigm shift, the real turning point, happens in 1765.
Right. The text mentions the acquisition of the Diwani rights.
Yes. The Mughal emperor basically grants the East India Company the Diwani, which is the legal authority over revenue and civil justice for Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa.
Okay, wait. Let's unpack the reality of that for a second. That means a board of corporate directors sitting in an office somewhere in London is now legally entitled to extract the agricultural and commercial wealth of tens of millions of people halfway across the globe.
It's staggering. And this creates an immediate massive problem back in Britain because suddenly the British Parliament realizes they have a deeply problematic entity on their hands.
How so?
Well, you have these company employees returning to London with unfathomable wealth. They're buying massive estates, they're bribing politicians.
Oh, wow.
Right. But meanwhile, the company itself is somehow teetering on the edge of bankruptcy because of sheer mismanagement and these constant expensive wars they were fighting.
So the employees are getting rich, but the company is failing.
Exactly. So Parliament realizes they cannot just let a rogue, heavily armed monopoly operate with zero oversight. They have to put a leash on it.
So Parliament steps in to play the role of a regulatory watchdog. They passed the Regulating Act of 1773.
Yeah, that was their very first attempt to control the company. They didn't take it over completely. They just said, hey, we need to know what you're doing.
Right.
So they required the company's directors to report all their revenue and military affairs to the British government. And they also tried to centralize the internal management over in India.
They made the governor of Bengal the governor general, right? Warren Hastings.
Exactly. And they subordinated the other regions like Bombay and Madras to him. They even set up a Supreme Court in Calcutta.
Which, reading through the source material, seems like it was mainly set up to prosecute company employees who were taking bribes or, engaging in private off-the-books trade.
Yes, exactly.
So the 1773 Act was essentially a massive corporate anti-corruption measure. But it seems like simply asking a wildly corrupt corporation to police itself didn't exactly work out.
Oh, it failed miserably. I mean, the company's officials were just too entrenched. Plus, the communication delay between London and Calcutta took months.
Right. No emails back then.
Exactly. So the corruption just continued. And the British Parliament realizes that simply regulating isn't enough. They have to actively manage the situation. Which leads to a much more aggressive intervention, Pitt's India Act of 1784.
And this act invents a truly bizarre administrative mechanism. The source calls it a system of double government.
It's a fascinating workaround, honestly. The British government didn't want to outright nationalize the company just yet, so they split the company's functions right down the middle. They basically said, okay, The court of directors, the corporate guys, you keep managing the commercial trade. But for anything political, military, or involving revenue, we are creating a brand new body called the Board of Control.
And that board reports to the government.
Directly to the British cabinet.
They literally forced a corporate board to share a desk with a government oversight committee.
They did. And the most telling detail of the 1784 Act is that it was the very first time the company's territories in India were officially referred to as the British possessions in India.
Oh, wow. The mask was slipping?
Totally. The British government was asserting ultimate sovereignty.
And this centralization just keeps accelerating, doesn't it? Because by the time we hit the Charter Act of 1833, the transformation is pretty much complete. The East India Company is legally stripped of its right to trade.
Right.
Imagine a trading company being told by the government, you aren't allowed to trade anymore. You are now just a bureaucratic agency managing our territory.
They literally went from merchants to middle management bureaucrats. The 1833 Act created a single powerful authority. The Governor-General of Bengal was upgraded to the Governor-General of India.
Lord William Bentinck.
Yes, and he was given exclusive legislative powers for the entirety of British India. The local governments in Bombay and Madras completely lost their ability to make their own laws. It was absolute top-down centralization.
But absolute power requires a massive bureaucracy to actually enforce it, which brings up something in the 1853 Charter Act that I think is incredibly relevant to anyone listening today.
The civil service exams.
Yes. The 1853 Act introduced an open competition system for selecting civil servants.
This is a massive shift in how administration functioned, because prior to this, if you wanted a lucrative administrative job in India, you basically needed to be the nephew of someone on the company's board of directors.
Right. It was pure patronage.
Exactly. But the 1853 Act, following the recommendations of the Macaulay Committee, threw that out and instituted a merit-based examination system.
So, if you've ever sat in a freezing gymnasium, taking some grueling standardized test for a government job or even a corporate certification, you are participating in a bureaucratic tradition that the British were stress testing in India in the 1850s.
That's a great way to put it.
And they opened it up to Indians as well, right? At least on paper.
On paper is the key phrase there. Because to actually take the exam, an Indian candidate had to travel all the way to London.
Wow.
And then they had to pass tests on subjects like ancient Greek and Latin.
Oh, come.
I know. So while it was technically an open competition, the mechanism was highly exclusionary. But structurally, the 1853 Act also did something else that was crucial. It separated the executive functions from the legislative functions of the Governor-General's Council.
So it basically created a miniature parliament in India.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Establishing the concept that making laws is a distinct, specialized function of government.
Okay, so by the 1850s, the company has built the skeleton of a modern state. You've got a centralized executive, a specialized legislature, and a merit-based civil service. But that corporate governance model was entirely unsustainable.
No, you cannot run a diverse subcontinent of millions of people like a hostile corporate takeover forever.
The tension was building, and it took a literal war to finally break the system.
Yes, the breaking point was 1857, the massive rebellion known variously as the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence. It shook the British establishment to its absolute core.
They realized the East India Company had fundamentally botched the management of the territory.
Exactly.
So the British Crown finally steps in directly. We enter a new era from 1858 to 1909. They passed the Government of India Act 1858, which they rather smugly titled the Act for the Good Government of India.
Very humble.
Right, and they abolished the East India Company completely.
The middleman is gone. All the power, territories, and revenues are transferred directly to the British Crown. The Governor-General gets a shiny new title, the Viceroy of India.
Lord Canning, right?
Yes, making him the direct, personal representative of the British monarch. And they also set up a Secretary of State for India back in London, a cabinet member with absolute authority over the Indian administration.
But here's the problem. They've centralized power even more, but the 1857 rebellion taught them that ruling entirely from the outside, with zero local input, is just a recipe for constant, violent revolution.
Right, they needed a safety valve. They needed some local cooperation.
So we see the British initiate what they called the policy of association. Through the Indian Councils Acts of 1861 and 1892, they slowly, almost grudgingly, began allowing a few Indians into the legislative councils.
As non-official members.
Right. And by 1892, they even allowed these councils to discuss the budget and ask questions to the executive.
But let's look at the mechanics of that. Discussing the budget is very different from controlling the budget.
Exactly.
They were giving the illusion of inclusion without actually handing over the levers of power.
Right.
Which brings us to a really controversial piece of legislation, the Indian Councils Act of 1909, usually called the Morley-Minto Reforms.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because on the surface, this 1909 act looks like a major step forward.
It expands the size of the legislative councils significantly.
Right. And for the very first time, it allowed an Indian, Satyendra Prasad Sinha, to join the Viceroy's exclusive executive council.
Which was huge.
It was. But I have to push back hard on this being framed as a purely progressive reform. Because at the exact same time they are bringing Indians into the executive process, this 1909 act introduces the concept of a separate electorate for Muslims.
Yes.
Meaning Muslim members were to be elected exclusively by Muslim voters. How is legally dividing the population by religion a step forward for the country?
Well, from the British perspective at the time, they genuinely argued that they were simply protecting a minority interest from being overwhelmed by a Hindu majority. They framed it as a necessary protection.
Okay, but if you look at the actual mechanics of it...
Oh, you're absolutely right to be skeptical. It was an incredibly cynical strategy. I mean, Lord Minto, the viceroy at the time, actually became known as the father of communal electorate.
Wow. That's a legacy.
Yeah. The British were decentralizing some superficial power to appease moderate nationalists. But by institutionalizing separate electorates, they were legally embedding divisions into the political fabric of the subcontinent. It was a classic divide and rule mechanism.
A mechanism that would eventually fracture the entire region.
Exactly.
But as we move past World War I, the British realized that token representation and these cynical divisions aren't enough to stop the growing independence movement. The Indian people had contributed massively to the British war effort, and they demanded a say in their own country.
They had to start promising something tangible. The new buzzword became responsible government.
Right.
In 1917, the British government declared that their objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. And this materializes in the Government of India Act of 1919, also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms.
And this act introduces some really heavy, complex machinery. First, we get bicameralism at the center.
Yes, meaning a legislature with two houses, an upper house and a lower house, much like the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives or the British House of Lords and Commons.
And it also introduced direct elections for the first time.
It did. But the source notes that the franchise was still very limited.
Right. And for the listener, when we say franchise here, we are talking about the right to vote. It wasn't universal. You only got to vote if you met strict property, tax, or education qualifications.
So only a tiny fraction of the population actually had a voice.
Exactly. But the most infamous mechanism of the 1919 Act was a system introduced in the provinces called diarchy. The word literally means double rule.
Yeah, and this is where it gets messy.
Help us visualize this, because reading the technical definition of diarchy in the text is a bit headache-inducing.
Okay, think of diarchy like a business with two managers who despise each other, and they're forced to run a company together.
Sounds terrible.
It was. The British divided provincial government subjects into two categories. First, you had reserved subjects. These were the crucial levers of state power, law and order, police, finance, land revenue.
The stuff that matters.
Right. And these were controlled exclusively by the British governor and his executive council, who answered to no one but the British.
Okay, and the other category?
The transferred subjects. These were areas like education, health, agriculture, and local government. These were handed over to Indian ministers who were actually responsible to the elected legislative council.
So to use your metaphor, the Indian minister is the manager in charge of fixing the hospital and the school, but the British governor is the manager who holds the checkbook and controls the security.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the result was absolute administrative chaos.
I can imagine.
I mean, how can an Indian minister of agriculture enact any meaningful reform if the British finance department refuses to allocate any funds for it? It was a system designed to fail. It gave the Indian ministers the responsibility for public welfare, but none of the actual power or money to execute it.
So diarchy was a disaster. Which brings us to the real behemoth of the colonial era, the Government of India Act of 1935.
Oh, this one is huge.
It's a massive, incredibly detailed piece of legislation. over 320 sections. It finally abolished that clumsy provincial diarchy and replaced it with provincial autonomy.
Yes, the provinces were finally allowed to act as relatively autonomous units of administration within their defined spheres. The 1935 Act also tried to establish an all-India federation.
Trying to pull together the British provinces and the independent princely states into one system.
Right. Now, the princely states refused to join, so the federation never actually happened, but the structure was there.
And the most important structural piece of the 1935 Act was how it divided legislative powers. It created 3 lists: a federal list, a provincial list, and a concurrent list.
This is the core of federalism. The federal list contained subjects for the center, things like foreign affairs and the military. The provincial list was for the local governments, things like public order and sanitation.
Wait, explain the concurrent list. Because federal is national, provincial is local, but what goes in that third bucket?
The concurrent list is the overlapping Venn diagram in the middle.
Okay.
These are subjects where both the central government and the provincial governments are allowed to make laws. Things like criminal law, marriage and divorce, or bankruptcy. It's an area of shared responsibility.
But crucially, if a provincial law clashed with a federal law on a concurrent subject, the federal law would override it, right?
You got it. It was federalism, but with a strong central bias.
And the 1935 Act also established the Reserve Bank of India to control currency. It set up a federal court, expanded the public service commissions. When you look at this act, it sounds almost identical to the structure of the modern Indian government.
Because it is.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that the framers of the independent Indian Constitution didn't try to hide this fact. The 1935 Act was so incredibly comprehensive, so meticulously detailed regarding the nuts and bolts of administration, that it became the primary blueprint for the Constitution of India a decade later.
I love how Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of the Indian Constitution, addressed this.
Oh, it's great moments.
Because critics in the assembly were basically accusing the drafting committee of plagiarism, right? Of just carbon copying this old British law. And Ambedkar stands up and essentially says, I make no apologies.
He was unapologetically pragmatic. He argued that at this late stage in human history, nobody holds a patent right on the fundamental ideas of a constitution.
Exactly.
He openly admitted to ransacking all the known constitutions of the world to find the specific mechanisms that would actually work for the unique complexities of India. He didn't care where the plumbing came from as long as the pipes didn't leak.
Which brings us to the dramatic final act. The administrative machine has been built over 300 years, but by the mid-1940s, the political reality is violently breaking down.
The British are exhausted from World War II.
The domestic agitation in India is overwhelming, and the transition of power becomes inevitable.
We reach the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This gives immediate effect to the Mountbatten Plan, partitioning the subcontinent and creating 2 independent dominions, India and Pakistan.
It officially ends British rule. The office of the viceroy is abolished.
But the most crucial structural change here involved the Constituent Assembly. This assembly had already been formed in 1946, originally just to draft a framework. But the 1947 Independence Act legally transforms them into a fully sovereign body.
They were no longer subjects.
Exactly. They had the power to frame any constitution they wanted, and they could legally repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself.
And this leads to one of the most incredible, high-pressure administrative feats in modern history, because the Constituent Assembly had to perform what the source calls double duty.
Right.
Imagine trying to build a plane while simultaneously flying it through a hurricane. That is what this double duty was.
It's the perfect analogy, because on certain days, the Assembly would meet purely as a constituent body, chaired by Dr. Rajendra Prasad.
And on these days, their job was philosophical and structural, debating abstract fundamental rights, the independence of the judiciary, the nature of liberty.
And then the very next day, those exact same people would walk into the same room and meet as the Dominion Legislature, the first parliament of free India, chaired by G.V. Mavlankar.
And on those days, they weren't debating philosophy. They were passing emergency legislation to deal with the immediate, chaotic reality of a newly partitioned country facing a massive refugee crisis, food shortages, and the integration of hundreds of princely states.
The cognitive load required to do that is staggering, managing the terrifying reality of the present while meticulously architecting the rules of the future.
It's unbelievable. And the final product of that meticulous architecture was adopted on November 26, 1949, and officially enacted on January 26, 1950, the Constitution of India. It became, and it still remains, the lengthiest written constitution in the world.
The source material actually describes it as an elephantine document.
That's a great word for it.
It originally contained a preamble, 395 articles, and 8 schedules. Most modern constitutions are a fraction of that size.
So why is it so massive? Well, the text points to 4 main mechanisms. First, the sheer geographical vastness and diversity of the country.
Right.
If you are trying to write a single rule book that works for the Himalayas, the deserts of Rajasthan, and the tropical coastlines of Kerala, accommodating countless languages and tribes, you need a lot of clauses.
Definitely. And second, historical factors. They were heavily influenced by that bulky 1935 Act we discussed.
Right. Third, they chose to have a single unified constitution for both the central government and all the states. Unlike the U.S., where individual states have their own distinct constitutions, India put everything into one master document.
And fourth, you have to look at who was in the room. The Constituent Assembly was heavily dominated by legal luminaries.
World-class lawyers.
Exactly. They didn't want to leave anything up to interpretation or ordinary legislation. They wanted every administrative detail explicitly codified to prevent future loopholes.
So they synthesized everything. They took the parliamentary system, the cabinet government, and the rule of law heavily from their long, painful experience with the British.
They looked to the U.S. Constitution for the concept of fundamental rights and an independent Supreme Court.
They borrowed from the Irish Constitution for directive principles.
And they layered all of that philosophical framework directly on top of the heavy bureaucratic machinery of the 1935 Act.
It is a masterpiece of adaptation, a uniquely Indian blend of rigidity and flexibility, forged in the fires of colonialism, partition, and the sheer necessity of survival.
It truly is a marvel.
So just to summarize the incredible arc we've unpacked today, we started with a piece of paper in the year 1600 granting a trading monopoly to a group of merchants. And that simple business mandate set off a 350-year chain reaction.
A business becomes a territorial power.
Parliament panics and builds a watchdog bureaucracy.
That bureaucracy deepens into a massive colonial state.
And ultimately, the scaffolding of that colonial state is seized, stripped of its imperial intent, and repurposed to hold up the world's most detailed democratic constitution.
Which leaves us with a fascinating, somewhat provocative thought for you to consider long after this deep dive is over. This raises an important question. Look around at the legal, bureaucratic, or institutional systems you interact with in your own daily life.
Yeah.
The way your local city council operates, how your civil service exams are structured, or even how property deeds are recorded. How much of what we accept as totally modern, rational administration is actually just the ghost of a centuries-old colonial or corporate system seamlessly running in the background of our lives?
It really makes you wonder how many global tech conglomerates today might accidentally be building the governmental systems of the 23rd century without even realizing it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into your customized sources.
Thanks for listening.
Just remember, the absolute best way to understand the complex machinery of our present reality is to pull apart the historical background that built it.